I had to bring this tie out of mothballs. I hadn't had a chance to wear it much lately. So anyway, my wife said, "Are you actually going to wear that?" I said, "Actually." So maybe they'll win today. It's hard to beat the same team 3 times in a row, so they beat Kentucky twice. We're glad everybody's here today. Glad you braved all the worrying about the rain and storm. It's maybe come a little bit, but it's supposed to come more, so we're glad that y'all are here. Kathy, we're glad that you're with us today. We hope your dad's doing better. Kathy has warned me that if her phone goes off, that her phone rings the Alabama marching song. Maybe we'll be lucky and nobody will call. You probably got somebody timed to call you 10 after 10. That's all right. We've heard that song before, haven't we, Billy? We're glad that George has got friends. I mean, we're just... I was a Southern Baptist for 30 years. I think really good Baptists, the way they used to be, are kind of like really good Methodists are today. So we're glad you all are here. We hope it. Well, I don't either, but I was about gone, but then the Methodists pulled me back in. So I've always been glad about that. But we're mostly glad that George has got friends. We hope he's going to take you out to Ruth Chris for lunch today. That's usually what he stands up and says when his friends come in. That he's going to take them to Ruth Chris for lunch. So, oh, that's about right. Okay.
With a coupon.
What?
With a coupon.
Yeah, we're the coupon.
We cleaned up George. We're very well. We're very well.
Well, okay. God bless you if you know George that well and you came anyway, but that's okay. Y'all have heard me talk from time to time about this great teacher I had named Robert Hartman. In 1933, when he was 23 years old, Hartman was on the list of the top 50 up-and-coming people in all of Germany, which that would have been a big deal. Of course, on that same list was Adolf Hitler. And so Robert Hartman was one of the few people, early on especially, who saw through Hitler and was involved in some of the very earliest resistance movements within Germany to Hitler. His life became almost like a James Bond story, and several times he was almost caught and killed. Finally, he had to escape from Germany, and he spent a little time in England, and then he came to the United States, and he spent the rest of his life in the United States. During the war years, he would kind of be slipped up to Washington, where he would work for something called the OSS, which was the precursor of the CIA, and he was involved in opening underground networks into Germany. He always had a little bit of survivor's guilt because he left there, but had he not left, he would have died. When he would go to Washington, especially in the very hardest parts of the war, when Germany was making so many advances, he would say pretty boldly, you've got to worry about Hitler in Germany for a little while because they've got some momentum. But you don't have to worry about them over the long term. They will fail. And people who were maybe more expert about war and all the machinery of war would argue back at him that how could he be sure that something that was showing this much power would fail? And Hartman's answer was always this: Hitler has plenty of mechanical power. Hitler has plenty of technological power. Hitler has plenty of manpower. But then Hartman would say, but what Hitler and the Nazis lack for is goodness. And if you peel the bark back a little bit and you look beyond some of the external manifestations of all that they were accomplishing, you would find an emptiness, and that emptiness was an emptiness of goodness. And if there was not goodness, ultimately people would fail. And of course, it got very ugly, this absence of goodness. But this absence of goodness, just as he predicted, failed. Hartman talked about the distinction between competence and character. And so he said that if you look out at the beginning of the Second World War, that Adolf Hitler and his forces had plenty of competence, but they lacked for character, which he identified as soul and as goodness. And if you lacked in those areas, you would not sustain yourself. You would ultimately fail. When he began to become very engaged in life in the United States, and this would have been the early 1950s, he really worried about the United States, that he deeply loved. And he looked at all the things that were going on in our country at the end of the Second World War. He looked at all the things that were happening as we kind of regenerated our economy and changed our world with technology and information across the 1950s. And so he always was proud of the fact that America had more competence about getting things done than maybe anybody that had ever been on this planet before. And so he saw us as a progressive, forward-moving country. But then his worries would click in. And he would say, we're doing all these things to educate these kids for competency. We're doing all these things to reward people that come up with competent ways of doing things. But what are we doing to educate people for character? Are we becoming so quickly moving forward with all that we can do with our competence that we've forgotten to ask the question, what does character mean? Because ultimately, it is character that will cause people to rise in a way that can sustain us. It's interesting to me, and I'll tell you why in a second. It's interesting to me that one of his very first kind of academic jobs was at a school in Chicago. And he always believed in going out and working in the real world, so he got a job working in leadership development for Sears Roebuck. Remember when they called it Sears Roebuck? And of course, the presence of Sears Roebuck in Chicago was an amazingly important. I think that if I can remember back to those days, I would say that Sears Roebuck in the 1950s was kind of like Amazon is today. They had this amazing network of ways to distribute their products. And I'll bet many of us can remember the day, 2 or 3 times a year, that the Sears Roebuck catalog would come and we'd go through every page like it was the wish list of life. And so Hartman goes to work with these people. And they would bring in a room full of people that were their leaders, that were going to drive the direction of that company. And Hartman would get a bunch of flip charts or chalkboards or whatever they had in those days and times, and he would ask this question, what does it mean for Sears Roebuck to have competency? And oh Lord, they could fill those boards up just so quickly with sales figures and new products and new markets and new ways of communicating with people, all of which meant, what does it mean for Sears Roebuck to have competency? And after that kind of had got all kind of said, then Hartman would say, now we got to ask the important question. What does it mean for Sears Roebuck to have character? Because if you don't ask the character question, the competency question will soon become short-lived and beside the point. What does it mean for Sears Roebuck to have competency? Now, he never knew what answer he would get to that question. Because for every different kind of organization and for every different person, that question's probably going to be answered in some different way. And so exploring what that question means for your company, or exploring what that question means for you as an individual, it's different for everybody. And old Hartman would talk about how people would look at the floor and shuffle their feet and stumble around in their stuttering answers. They were good at the competency part, but they couldn't quite grasp the goodness part or the character part. But he said that one of the proudest days of his entire life was one day in one of those meetings in Chicago that those Sears Roebuck people began to talk about all of the money that they had in the bank. All of the money that was kind of the scorecard of their competency. And they began to talk about that character might mean that they needed to do something different with their money. Sometimes character can mean that. And in that instance, on that day, with this man's leadership, an old philosopher, they began to talk about creating a profit-sharing program that could benefit their employees all the way down to the most entry-level people that they had. That became character for that company. Life has a funny way of coming full circle. You remember when Sears had a store downtown? Some of you are that old. Maybe one or two. My aunt worked down there in ladies' ready-to-wear. I'll bet some of you have bought stuff from my aunt. And she worked down there for 30 years. She was about the most dedicated employee that they had. She got an award one time for actually tackling a robber who had tried to go out of her area with furs. Remember when they sold furs at Sears? But what she really loved was every time she got a bonus and every time she got a commission, she put it into Sears stock because of their profit-sharing program. And when she finally got old and retired and moved to a little farm up in McMinn County, she'd go out every month and she'd get her Sears check. And from that Sears check, she built herself the home that she died in eventually. She always drove a nice car. And two of her great nephews, she put them through college, and going to their graduations was one of the proudest moments of their lives. Because somewhere in Chicago, somebody had decided that a company can have competence and a company can have character. And so, issues of competency and character must always be held together, must always be inseparable, or we can create something that is really marvelous in terms of what we competently do, but that may have a vulnerable shallowness in terms of who we are. I think the Bible, if you look at it, has an awfully lot to say about this particular theme. And so I'll give you about 4 reminders, and you can go look up 4 or 5 more for yourself. We kind of deride Saul, that first king of Israel, because the end of Saul's life was pretty miserable, and so he kind of is portrayed in our stereotypes as the guy in the black hat, as kind of the enemy. But sometimes we ought to remind ourselves that Saul was chosen by God. Sometimes we ought to remind ourselves that the Bible describes Saul, of all of the men of Israel, as being head and shoulders above everybody else. We ought to remind ourselves that the greatest enemies that Israel had in that day and time were the Philistines that lived over on the coast and a little south toward Egypt today. And they had learned how to smelt iron and create steel. So their competency had given the Philistines the best swords, the best fighting instruments, the best shields that there were. And Saul goes out and subdues the threat of the Philistines. And so before we go too far down a negative trail, Saul was one of the most competent people of that day and age. He brought Israel to a place of safety and brought them out of the dark. But then we know that Saul began to have character issues, right? And maybe we might even think that his character issues were small because it was mostly petty jealousy over David. He had to be number one. His ego had to keep him at the front end of the spotlight. But sometimes there are no petty vulnerabilities that are caused by a lack of character. And before we know it, that lack of character took a strong man and a strong leader to his knees. And we also know that suddenly, when Saul loses his character, that the Philistines and their armies have a resurgence and almost bring Israel to its knees. We can look at David. And David had all kind of competence. David had the competence that allowed him to come and be king after Saul and finally put the Philistines down forever. They were never a threat after David. We know that David created the greatest small nation that world had ever known. And as he ruled from his own city at Jerusalem, he was able to dominate a part of the world that had never been dominated by someone that was in a nation of his size. And so if you talk about competency of leadership, David was supremely competent. But we know about David. And we know that one day he goes out to look on his city and all the grandeur that he's now beginning to feel like that he created. And he sees Bathsheba. And although she's someone else's wife and he knows that, he makes sure that that man is put at the front end of a battle line where he dies. And Bathsheba is his own. And isn't it interesting? From that moment in which there is a lack of goodness, a lack of character, David's story goes downhill. And before you know it, David's family is disintegrating. Before you know it, his interpersonal relationships with his wife are going away. And all of a sudden you see Israel launch itself into a decline that it never really was able to regain as a nation. Solomon doesn't help the story very much. Solomon begins his life on a high note of competency and a high note of character. And Solomon comes to God and says, I don't need a bigger treasury and I don't need bigger armies. I need your wisdom. He started off on a high note of character. But then Solomon and his armies began to go out and conquer other nations. Solomon and his people that run his money go out and begin to make more money than Israel had ever made. The treasuries are full. And Solomon begins to believe that with every victory there should come a few concubines. That was their nice way of calling them. With every deal it needed to be sealed with a few concubines. That's what they called them, you see. And suddenly Solomon's character goes under the table or under the sheets or under something. And so suddenly Solomon's reign comes apart. We could talk about Samson and we could talk about Delilah and we could go all the way to that iconic picture of the stalwart power of competence brought to its knees by a lack of character. But you know, that's all in the Old Testament. If you look in the New Testament and you look at the two primary figures that are there, the figure of Jesus and the figure of Paul. And we look at Jesus' life through a microscope over 3 years. And we look at Paul's life through a microscope of his travel over almost 20 years. And we have all of those stories about Jesus and all of those stories about Paul. And in not one single solitary moment of those stories do we see in those two characters a failure of character. And their teachings, and their word, and their life, and their example lives on to us today. Character, goodness, and soul have that kind of power. Today it sometimes seems that we don't have much interest in issues issues of character. There are modern religious leaders out there today who are saying that they're not very interested in how people are living their lives. That if they do things to defend the faith, that gives them a pass. That gives them a pass even with God. I don't know how they can speak for God in that way. But can you imagine that there are modern religious leaders standing up in churches today saying that how people live their lives doesn't matter as long as they are defenders of the faith? That is mind-boggling to me, that could ever be said from a pulpit or ever be said by a true churchman. Because don't we understand that the primary way that we have of defending our faith is by living our faith? Let me say that again. The primary way that we have of defending our faith is living our faith. If we don't live our faith, then everything that we say in its defense, everything that we say about it that we believe is good or right or nice, is an emptiness and a hollowness that can destroy. Aristotle lived 3 centuries before Jesus. And Aristotle looked at the world and saw it as a world that was filled with activity. And when Aristotle began to analyze the world, he began to analyze it in terms of 4 different kinds of activities. This will be on your test next week, so I expect you to remember it. The first activity that Aristotle looked at was physical activity. And so he lived in the time in which there were Olympics being held, and there were contests that kind of exemplified and celebrated the physical nature of human beings. He lived in a world in which people were outgoing all over every place in terms of physical activity. They were building things from boats to gigantic temples and governmental buildings. So there was huge amounts of physical activity. Then Aristotle said there's all kind of mental activity. And in that ancient Greece, as we know, people began to talk about and discover and think about being able to be rationally brilliant. And so they began to develop educational institutions, and they began to help people understand how to do things with rationality, from language to numbers, that no civilization had ever done before. So there was rational activity. And then Aristotle got a little bit more complex, and he said there's emotional activity. He said we as human beings have the capacity to have feelings. And of course in ancient Greece, sometimes those feelings were manifested in the arts. Sometimes those feelings were manifested in the creations of art that they were able to come to. Sometimes that emotion was experienced in the comedies that they would go and see, and the dramas particularly that they would go and see. That all was emotional activity. But that's just 3. Then Aristotle said, beyond physical activity, beyond rational mental activity, beyond emotional feelings activity, there is what he called activity of soul. And that was the base of it all. And without activity of soul, then all of those other competencies and all of those other experiences suddenly become very, very shallow and undependable and unsustainable. There has to be a base of activity of soul. And when Aristotle was asked to explain what he meant by that, Aristotle said, activity of soul is character. And that character is the highest excellence that human beings can be drawn to by God. activity of soul is character, and it is the highest excellence that human beings can be driven to. He said, let that evaporate. And all of a sudden our emotions can begin to get tangled with each other and unfettered. Let that evaporate, and all of a sudden our minds and our logic and our way of thinking about things can get totally deconstructed. And let that evaporate, and ultimately all of those things that we can do physically and all of those things that we can accomplish with physical effort, all of that becomes highly, highly vulnerable. There must be activity of soul. And then he said, if we don't have activity of soul, we'll become miserable people. And then he said, and if we don't have activity of soul, then we will become people that only know how to rage at each other like feral dogs in the street. And then he said, if we don't have activity of soul, then we will become violent with each other. And that violence that we'll have to worry about will not be external, distant violence, but internal violence that is close at hand. And finally he said, if we don't have activity of soul, the odds of us being very happy are slim and none. Competence and character. We become soulless. Our values become misaligned and bent out of shape. And misshapen and misaligned values will never lead a nation very far. In the second book of Chronicles, in the 7th chapter, are these words. If my people who are called by my name humble themselves and pray and seek my face, I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sins and heal their land. I believe we need that kind of healing, because we are hitting on all cylinders as far as competence is concerned. And we have gone washed and astray with character. Let us pray. Help us, our Father, and continue to bless us if you can, that we could be the most competent nation in all this world. And help us that we might find ways of defining character by helping others in need and being a place of peace and being the very best example of what it means to be followers of God as a nation as we can be. But, oh God, help us to know, as your Son so much taught us, as your Word so much taught us, help us to know that all the competency in the world will never carry us, that we must have character. And that that character must begin at the top of our lives as a nation, and that that character must continue through people in places of leadership. That character must find its way into people that run businesses and create our commerce. That that character must run through our churches, and that it must be a part of our individual lives. So help us, oh God, that we might always ask what it means for us to have competence, but help us that we might ask what it means for us to have character, and that we might even be so bold as to really and truly, beyond just our words, use your Son as the model for that. For we ask in his name. Thank you all for coming today. Thanks for visiting with us. Come back again. We'll see you all. Anything else? Charles says we can leave.
Good to go.
Thank you.